Great. Hi, everyone. Nice to virtually meet you. Thanks for joining us. And of course, as Murphy's Law would dictate, my dog is barking in the background, so hopefully you can't hear that too badly. I'm going to talk to you today about, well, the title of the talk is, Will the Pandemic Change the 2020 Election? But I'll talk a little bit more broadly than just the election. I'm going to talk about the threat to our democratic institutions beyond just our elections, and also talk about what I think in all of the many challenges that we're facing, perhaps a rare opportunity to improve the function of our democracy. So a little bit about me, Mindy Romero. I'm faculty at the USC Price School of Public Policy. I direct a research center there called the California Civic Engagement Project. As the name of the research center suggests, we do research around civic engagement, political behavior. My individual research focuses on understanding political behavior, election reforms, how those can impact behavior, and particularly with an emphasis around the intersection of behavior and race and age, ethnicity. And I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions in the Q&A around my work or the work of my centers. So jumping in to the talk today at hand. There's been a lot of conversation, I think, around the country over the last 2-3 weeks, specifically around the election and what the impact of COVID-19 will be on the election. We've all heard, probably most of us, that a number of states, I think a dozen and counting states in the country, around the country, have postponed their primary elections. California, fortunately, we had it on March 3rd, Super Tuesday. And just really the next week, we saw states grappling with the question around postponing their elections. But this is the question around the challenges from COVID-19 extend far beyond whether we should hold an election, how we should hold an election, but also really extends to the ability of the public to participate fully and in a representative way in decision-making in our country. So state and local legislative bodies across the United States are postponing and modifying their meetings, their decision-making meetings, their public meetings, to eliminate that in-person access. We know that there's many logical reasons for this, but still, as we see this unfolding, there are key decision points to be made in terms of how we limit public access and the alternatives that are available to ensure that legislative bodies are both still hearing from the public, which they need, right, to hear a full representation of voices and concerns, and also that the public has that ability to still engage in a meaningful way. And let me know, Hari, if there's any audio difficulty.
Will do.
In California, just a couple of weeks ago, our governor, Gavin Newsom, issued an emergency executive order that suspended a lot of the laws that we see around public access to decision-making bodies, legislative bodies, both state level and local level. So limiting in person or completely eliminating in person, but also requiring that people have the ability, the public has the ability to be able to phone in or join online in some way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So while we must be, of course, vigilant in the spread or preventing the spread of COVID-19, I argue that, and many of us argue that we have to demand of our public officials as they do this work, as they make these decisions, as they continue on with the work that they're doing at the local and state level, that they do everything in their power to maximize the ability of the public to engage in a meaningful way. And as we make these decisions, so things like aggressive outreach to make sure that folks understand that these changes have been made, noticing of meetings, how and when they can participate in. And that means that it might not be some of the traditional ways that we've noticed meetings, right? To consider that people are not looking in some of those, or potentially in some of those same places, making sure that we're aggressively outreaching and notifying the public, and that when they can participate, they not only can participate by phone and by video, but they also can submit things like written testimony, that they can ask questions, that there still is that ability to engage in a two-way dialogue where appropriate, right, on the agenda. At the same time, and this may seem a little counterintuitive, but I think it's very important that we limit, where possible, at least in this early stage, limit the type of decisions that public or legislative bodies can make. So if not as many eyes are on them and the public is not as participating as much, even in robust outreach and even in the most creative kind of circumstances, we know that still there's a reality of the public, right, being going through all of these changes that we're all going through together, and the likelihood that many people aren't participating as much. So considering that, so things like decisions period should be limited where they can be. So limited to things like budgets, limited to things like, of course, decisions around public health. But as it stands now, at least, again, in the early stages, as we're learning kind of the impact of some of these decisions on our mitigations on public participation, limit those big decisions that essentially could end up being done, right, with very little public impact or public input outside the public view. We want to make sure that that not only the public is participating, but that also our many well-intended public officials aren't inadvertently put in a situation where they could be pressured because those decisions are made outside the public view. We want to protect them as well, right? So otherwise, any of those kinds of decisions could potentially, at best, be ill-informed, and at worst be an opportunity for malfeasance or something even worse. So transparency is very important in this whole process, again, for both the public and for public servants. And we need to make sure, essentially, that those that might have other political goals or economic goals aren't taking advantage of the changes that we see here. And I don't know if I emphasized this enough earlier, but that we, again, in the early stages, we're tracking and understanding. So if some of the mitigations that are put in place aren't working, that there is an expectation and an accountability to address that wherever possible. And again, things are evolving, and we may have or feel like we have limited ability to address or come up with additional changes or innovations, but there should be at least an accountability around how are these working to the best of our ability to gather data. How can we understand who's actually participating and address that as we go forward. Okay, so now let's switch to elections specifically, as I started off the conversation with that. So we know states have postponed, or many states have postponed their primary elections. There's a lot of conversation, though, of course, around the November election. And I think we've seen enough articles around, many of us, hopefully, to alleviate some of the concerns about the election being moved, but we should talk about it still. So can the general election itself, can that date be changed? Can it even happen? It would take an act of Congress to be able to change or delay the general election. And there's a very small window if they did that, because as we know, our Constitution tells us that we have to have a president on January 20th. So to be able to change it, there's a small window to be able to do that and still have essentially a functioning government. The 20th Amendment specifically dictates that the current president and vice president, their terms end. So if there is not an election, they term out and the rules of succession apply. Now, that sounds maybe fairly simple. It's not a simple thing, because presumably if the presidential election wasn't happening, or congressional elections aren't happening, elections at the Senate level, of course, are not happening, and congressional, for the House of Representatives, those elections are every 2 years. So if our president and vice president left office because there wasn't an election, that means that the entire House of Representatives would leave office as well. So it gets quite complicated after that. The Senate pro tem would step in. That also is complicated because every 6 years we have 6-year terms, of course, and so we have a rotating Senate. I won't get into all those details today. I have a few articles I can recommend if people are really interested in that. But it's incredibly unlikely that the bottom line, incredibly unlikely that we would see the election not happen at all, certainly. And if it were delayed, there's a very limited window to do that. And we would have a functioning government. But if the rules of succession did kick in, presumably there would be maybe some sort of chaos around that. But we won't get into all of that. So let's talk about all the other kinds of decisions that elections officials are making. So across the country, because of COVID, not just in delaying a primary, but certainly when it comes to the general election, state officials don't have, as I said, it takes an act of Congress. State officials don't have the ability, they have the ability to move primaries, but not the general themselves. So an election has to occur unless there's a change at the congressional level in US law. And assuming that is going to happen, then it's all about, at the state level, how is that election actually going to be executed? And very importantly, what is the access, right, the voters are going to have to being able to cast their ballot, and the decisions that are being made around putting on an election and around accessibility are going to have significant impacts on things like turnout and also the makeup of the election. So we think about high turnout elections and we think about low turnout elections. Many of us, in the field have assumed and looked forward to a high turnout this November. That may be something that we're not going to see now, but regardless whether it's high or low turnout, there's a question of representation. And in any given election, whether it's a midterm or a general, a high turnout, low turnout, we know that the population of voters, those actually casting a ballot in whatever form, mail, vote by mail, in person, in the United States, that set of voters is not representative of the population, even the eligible voter population. It's not representative, right? So our electorate, and definitely here in California still as well, even in all of our diversity, we have a more diverse electorate, but we don't have a representative electorate. So our electorate and across the country, generally speaking, is older, whiter, wealthier, more educated. And this has significant impacts, of course, on decisions that are made by those elected officials that are put into office. Here in California, we also have a very robust ballot initiative process, which we could also talk about today in terms of how COVID is impacting. So we don't have a representative electorate. Our democracy in terms of voting already doesn't function as well as I think we certainly want and need it to function. And the decisions that are making around that election officials around the country are making in terms of access really matter. So specifically vote by mail, lots of conversations around vote by mail, expanding it across the country. We saw a small amount of money, at least in terms of what we need, 400 million, put into the stimulus to aid states. But right now we have a good number of states across the country that do not have very large numbers of the population that use vote by mail. California, about 2/3 in our last election of voters were vote by mail. We're a pretty robust state. Of course, Oregon, Washington, some other states are essentially all vote by mail as well. We're essentially vote by mail. Oregon, Washington are vote by mail, and there's other states that are essentially vote by mail like us, or have very, very large numbers, I should say. But there's still a large number of states that still have limitations around vote by mail, require somebody to have an excuse, a reason for requesting and casting a vote by mail ballot, and kind of a spectrum in between that and everybody kind of automatically getting one. As we know in many of our counties in our state now under the Voters' Choice Act, people automatically get a vote by mail ballot. So for those states that don't have wide access to vote by mail, there is a huge capacity issue in terms of them being able to ramp up from a very small percentage of their population to everyone getting a vote by mail ballot. There's capacity issues, there's cost, there's things like optical scanners, there's the training that would be provided, and the list goes on. And then there's also the reality of all of those voters that might get that vote by mail ballot. How would they use it? Their lack of familiarity. Even in our state, we have about 30% of voters, generally speaking, that still use vote in person. And there's concerns in our state as our election leaders have come together to decide what to do, how to plan around November. What do we do with, how do we best serve and provide in-person options for those voters that have not been using vote by mail? Because presumably amongst that population in our state, some will switch to vote by mail in the crisis, but we cannot assume and expect that all of them will switch to vote by mail. And if they don't, the decisions that we make could inadvertently disenfranchise them. And across the country, in states that have very, very large in-person voting populations, there are concerns about the capacity of election officials and their systems, and also then the ability to convert voters, so to speak, to vote by mail. So lots of questions and concerns there. And our research at the California Civic Engagement Project, we've done a number of studies in California and have identified consistently from election to election that there are populations within our state. So it's also skewed in terms of demographics. Some groups are more likely to use in-person and less likely to use in-person than other groups. So in California, we've established for quite a number of years, even as vote by mail rates increase, we still see groups like Latinos and young people age 18 to 24 that use in-person voting more than other groups. And so you also have a disproportionate impact concern. All right, what else? So I think I've covered, yeah. So the decisions that are being made across the country matter. So let me talk a little bit about the opportunity that I mentioned at first. So concerns, challenges are immense, but and forgive the dog that's barking. The opportunity is kind of, if we move back a little bit and think about just changes, period, that are happening in our society. So we know, generally speaking, that institutions, all our institutions, change slowly, including our democratic institutions. It's often when we see kind of moments of big social disruption, historical moments of social disruption, that we see kind of movements or significant movements that happen in our institutions. And right now, if you look around us, we know currently, we're seeing changes to institutions such as the family, right? Work, the job market, education. And it's yet to be seen how extensive these will be, how many, what changes will kind of stay and be permanent in a sense. And certainly we will see things evolve. But changes are happening. And as we address, right, the needs and make purposeful changes in our democratic institutions, we can see changes that happen right on the fly with little data and little information that can be potentially negative, like some of the concerns around going all vote by mail without addressing fully the needs of in-person voters. But we also have an opportunity to be very purposeful and careful in our deliberations to maybe, as we come out of all of this, as we get through the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, that we maybe build something better. And that might sound like a bit of pie in the sky, but that's how we often can see significant positive change, is that as we go through these moments of disruption, they provide an opportunity as we're changing the rules, as we're changing our engagement, as we're talking about openly about issues like representation, that maybe we can build something better from that. That's not an easy thing to do. There's gonna be many, many forces right against that, including just, again, timeline, resources, political will. But I think this is actually an opportunity if our leaders think through going forward. And many of us, advocacy groups, academics, community groups, right, are part of that conversation and don't rely, or maybe rely is not the right word, don't accept kind of decisions that remain on the fly, and we should be demanding that kind of accountability going forward and assessing how these things are working. And again, those deeper conversations in terms of, well, at least should these be permanent? What should we be doing to make things better? And I think I will leave.
So Mindy, people have been sending in questions to me, so I thought I'll just start going over them in order that they came through.
Please do.
The first one, are there any implications anticipated on effects of CV-19 on census execution, completion, and accuracy on the November election?
And sorry, you said specific to census?
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly, yeah, that's an issue. I can't say that I should probably, publicly speak about that because I'm still gathering information myself in terms of the impacts on the census. I know anecdotally that there are, which is dangerous for a researcher to use that word, but, there's lots of concerns certainly, but some bright spots. I've talked to some advocacy groups that are working on outreach around the census, and something they didn't quite expect is, they've been calling and outreaching to folks, and In some ways, it's actually easier to get a hold of people because more people are home. So that was nice to hear, but clearly there's also many people that are not focused. Maybe didn't even see that envelope in the mail. On top of our larger concerns that we've had for a very, very long time around outreach and participation, particularly from underrepresented groups. But I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Another question from Malcolm. There is a $400 million stimulus act to aid states for elections. Any breakdowns?
Yeah, as I said, I think most of that money, from at least my understanding, is centered around vote by mail. And actually, I have a note on it too, if I just look at it here. The hope, of course, initially was that there was going to be provisions for 15-day early voting, no excuse voting, that I think almost entirely were supported by the Democrats. That didn't make it into the bill. Much larger amount of money that was requested that was reduced down to $400 million. But I think the general consensus is that it's about securing those in-person voting sites and to expand vote by mail. But I mean, I think the general consensus is that money is not enough, and it doesn't, again, address really specifically those capacity, that the unequal playing field and the differences in capacity, and how some states are just to be able to ramp up to all vote by mail. The reality is that it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money, much more than what they're getting at this point. I think on the positive side, I understand that some states are happy with the flexibility around the money, that there wasn't a lot of very specific mandates with it or requirements with it, and allows them to be able to work on the fly with an evolving landscape. And I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, another question that came in from Francis Lawrence. Apart from the electoral mechanics, the policy debate comes to the fore. Example, millions are losing their beloved private employer-based health insurance.
Yeah, and speaking of policy differences, I think I touched on this, but again, emphasizing that lack of representation in our electorate when I was talking about elections themselves and voting. There are differences, and we know this from research that has identified this, differences in those who vote and those who don't vote when it comes to policy preferences, right? So it's about selecting the elected officials that, somewhat ironically, those are the folks, right, that are going to be post-November continuing to fight COVID and secure our communities. And if we have fewer people voting in a less representative electorate that are selecting those folks, that matters. But ongoing, we know election after election, that an electorate, that a voting electorate that's not representative, means that we have policy priorities that are not, often are not addressed, right, because of that, or at least differing policy preferences. Now, I don't know if that actually answers your question. Do you want to say it again one more time, Hari?
That's what it was. I'll move on to the next one. We have
quite
a few that came through. This question is from Eric Lopez. Is the cost of voting by mail lower than in-person voting?
Oh, I think it really depends on the jurisdiction. As when California moved to the Voters' Choice Act, if you might be familiar with that, for those of you that are in California, 2018, 5 counties, in 2020, 15 counties adopted the Voters' Choice Act, which would, with LA being an exception, but which requires every registered voter to receive automatically, without requesting it, a vote by mail ballot, and then still requiring a reduction in the number, but still requiring vote centers to be open up to 11 days as opposed to just 1 day. There was a hope that system would be cost effective, would save money. Thus far, we haven't seen that, but that's also a unique system in the sense that it's a hybrid, right? It allows multiple options, including also dropping off your vote by mail at a ballot drop box. If a jurisdiction or elections office or county has not conducted vote by mail, there would be a lot of cost to be able to ramp up to that, right? The equipment, the staffing, the training, the printing of the ballots, the mailing and the postage. We have postage page here in California, but other states across the country don't. But in terms of being able to, I think it depends on the jurisdiction and where they're already at with vote by mail. We're hearing here in California that some jurisdictions that already have such a high, whether they're VCA or not, but already have such a high vote by mail use rate, that the difference add, to send, maybe if they're at 80%, to be able to send 20%, more vote by mail ballots. The trade-off works for them, right, in terms of the capacity and maybe cost as well. And that varies across California. Yeah.
Okay. Another question from Lynn. Will this crisis speed up electronic online voting? And how are the different parties responding to this technology?
No, I don't think so. Or if I argue, I think it shouldn't. We're not at a place. We haven't been at a place in our country before COVID to seriously consider online voting. So the political will isn't there, number one, and we still have great concerns around security, particularly in light of the 2016 election. If we were to look at that as an option now, I think going back to my earlier comments, making decisions in an emergency situation that could have long-term negative impacts. We certainly don't want to do that. And I think I can't imagine in just a few months that we'd be able to solve the security issues around online voting or mobile voting in a way that we could guarantee a safe and secure election. And then also public confidence is a big part of all of this, by the way, which I haven't talked about today, but certainly around online voting, public confidence would have to be there, and to be able to show that and prove, and essentially gain the public's trust around that, I think I would expect would be incredibly difficult in a few months.
Okay. Another question, and I'll probably get to two more with you. From Dr. Toddy, if general elections are postponed, can the president and VP continue on the interim basis until the elections?
So again, they term out, so to speak. The new president and vice president have to be sworn in on January 20th. The term ends at that point. So if there's not a general election, it's not a presidential election, our current president and vice president would no longer be in office after that date. And then it would move, as I said, to a line of succession, which gets very, very complicated. So it doesn't mean that the date can't be postponed. It doesn't mean, it means that if we certainly could have issues around selecting electors, because at a state level, there is actually no requirement for there to be an election, or at least across the country, to be an election, to hold an election to select electors, but state legislatures can do that themselves. It gets complicated, but if those folks, I know there are folks out there that are concerned that the current president, for instance, might be incentivized to move the election. In that sense, he would not be, because even if he wanted to do it, he would not be in office. He would not benefit from it.
And we'll do one more question.
At a different level, but not there.
If the national presidential election is disrupted, could California hold its own election to ensure Congress members are elected/re-elected? So that, for instance, the Speaker of the House is reelected. And would that make her the president, since she's third in line if there is no president or VP?
Well, as I mentioned before, if there's not a presidential election, we assume the date is the same for congressional elections. And House of Representatives, the term is every 2 years, right? So no one would be elected or reelected at the House of Representatives. So my understanding, at least, is that it would move beyond the Speaker of the House. California can hold elections, but to hold congressional or presidential elections, the U.S. law still dictates that. From my understanding, at least. I suppose we could, there could be pushes on that legally, potentially, but.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. I want to end us right at 1 o'clock, because this is supposed to be a half-hour talk. Thank you all for joining us today. We do have another Price Talks this Thursday at 12:30. I hope you will be able to join us again. And again, thank you so much to Mindy for joining us today. If anyone does have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll make sure that they get to Mindy. And everyone should have my email. It's on the invitation that was sent out.
And I'm certainly happy to field any direct questions via email if folks have anything they want to share with me.
Great.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you.